Right.
And that's what we said was going to come up.
Okay. Then you'll tell me what I need to do.
They're not viewing it as material.
Okay, good.
The definition is material statement.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Most of us
Okay.
are just doing it anyway.
Yes, I did.
And they're doing it just to,
Okay, but you don't think you should recommend them to do that?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think so. Unless
Okay.
unless somebody
Maybe we can talk tomorrow and then I can bring that to the Finance Committee
Yeah.
on we have a 5:30 meeting tomorrow.
Okay.
You want to come to 5:30 tomorrow?
I have that as well. Yeah, the 22nd, I know is on.
I'll send over the report.
I forget why I did that. And I know I have like 4s and 5s because people kept walking. And then now, yeah. I mean, I had to go to the bathroom. Well, that was just it. Sometimes Patrick was here, sometimes you were Patrick.
Okay. That's probably good.
Yeah, that's a good
Especially
thing,
compared
right?
to
Yeah, right.
This is, I obviously at 6:30. I was
Yep, I'm ready. Good evening. I'd like to call this meeting to order. It is November 24th, 2014. Madam Clerk, have we met all the noticing requirements for this meeting? And please call the roll.
Ms. Howard?
Here.
Ms. Crommeller?
Here.
Mr. Miller? Here. Mr. Liverman is absent. Ms. Butler?
Here.
Mr. Simon? Here. And Mayor Lemper.
Here. And now please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We're starting our meeting tonight with 4 sets of minutes, the minutes of September 8th, September 22nd, September 29th, and November 3rd. Are there any corrections for any of these minutes?
Yes, for several of them.
Okay.
So we should probably take them one at a time.
Okay. All right. We'll start with September 8th. Are there any changes for this one?
There was one resolution, 14-266, that Jay and I were indicated as introducing, and when in fact we had proposed tabling it. So that resolution, and I didn't go back and check who introduced it. So in the minutes, it's reflected incorrectly at this point.
So noted.
Okay. Are there any other corrections? Okay. And that can be fixed?
Yes, Mayor.
Right. So is there a motion to adopt with that correction?
So moved.
It's moved by Mr. Miller and seconded by Ms. Butler. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, the minutes of September 8th passed. Next are the minutes for September 22nd.
Yeah, one comment there. Several of the vote counts need to be corrected. They summed to 5 instead of 6. So the approval count was wrong, was low. The votes in favor. So Linda has the notes, but.
Are there any other changes for September 22nd? Seeing none, is there a motion with the changes from Mr. Simon?
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Ms. Butler and seconded by Ms. Krumiller. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, the minutes of September 22nd passed unanimously is corrected. Next, September 29th.
I'll move it.
Second.
Moved by Ms. Krumiller, seconded by Mr. Miller. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The minutes of September 29th passed unanimously. And finally, the minutes for November 3rd.
Yes, I have one correction there. I sent a correction to Ms. McDermott on the conversation during the discussion with President Eisgruber of Princeton University. I had asked whether there were any early insights from the planning process in terms of areas where there might be potential stress or conflict, and she's got the corrected wording.
Okay. Are there any other changes for the minutes of November 3rd?
Move approval.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Miller and seconded by Ms. Butler. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the minutes from November 3rd passed unanimously. And thank you for getting this big chunk done, too, and getting them up. Next, we come to the section of our meeting where we have comments from the public on items that are not on the agenda. And we had a sign-up sheet on the podium, so we'll start with the people who signed up for that. And the first is Mr. Harris. And if you could, we're trying to keep our meetings a little tighter, so Mr. Miller will be helping with the timing.
Maybe the briefest, yes. Madam Mayor, members of council, thank you. I am pleased to announce that there will be a demonstration in Princeton tomorrow concerning the ruling of the Ferguson grand jury in the case of Mike Brown, killed by policeman Darren Wilson on August 8th of this year. It is my understanding that the announcement will be made at 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. This peaceful demonstration will be held at Tiger Square on Nassau Street at 6 p.m. Please dress appropriately and bring a flashlight as needed. This demonstration, sponsored by Not in Our Town and the Coalition for Peace Action, is undertaken on behalf of racial justice, the end of gun violence by police as well as by citizens and residents, and the equal application of appropriate law and procedure. Please plan to attend. We cannot be silent. Thank you.
Oh, Daniel.
Thank you very much.
Will the protest take place even if he's indicted, or is it only if he's...
The demonstration will take place no matter what. The script will obviously vary according to what we still do not know. It has been very odd all the way along.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ms. Cherry?
Good evening, I'm Kip Cherry. As a follow-up to the opening of the new Dinky Station, this seems like a very important time to look at ridership and to revisit the MOU, which calls for an aggressive promotion plan to increase ridership. I should note that the elected officials responsible for the MOU showed great forethought, and Princeton University did too, including such an aggressive plan in the MOU. The concern now is that these provisions have not been implemented. It's time now to do so absolutely as soon as possible. Under an open request to New Jersey Transit, we have had the most recent data, which shows that ridership is down on the Dinky by 22% as compared to the same period in 2013. It's 22%. A good portion of this amount was a shift to the free Tiger Paw, and we're all hoping that those riders come back. Unfortunately, a percentage of these riders in all likelihood will not come back without a significant promotion program. But even if they do, we will still have an 8% loss in ridership. At the same time, we also know that West Windsor has fairly recently constructed additional parking spaces at Princeton Junction, and they're making them available to residents outside of West Windsor, including those in Princeton. And we know that there's a long-term trend by commuters towards obtaining spaces at Princeton Junction. Having a parking permit means a certainty for a commuter, which if you've ever been a commuter yourself, you know how critical that this factor is. Without going into a lot of detail, when I was a commuter in Pennsylvania, I had an assigned space. I rolled in there at 6:03 a.m. I had only a minute to to last me, and I had a train pass, and I had a free space. And it was very important that that all worked very smoothly every day. Upon approval, the MOU states that upon approval of this agreement, the university will work with the municipalities, the borough and the township, and local merchants to develop a formal plan to promote Dinky ridership, including but not limited to train ticket receipts being utilized to obtain discounts. Note that the MOU specifically refers to the use of discounts as well as other methods for getting riders back on the Dinky. And possibly such a plan could even entice some Princeton riders who have parking spaces at Princeton Junction to get off Alexander Street and return to the Dinky. So without further ado, I'm just going to sum up and say that I think it's time now to really take a really hard look at the MOU and to start implementing the various provisions in the MOU which call for an aggressive promotion program. Thank you very much, and I'm glad to answer any questions.
Thank you. And if you have written remarks and you want to submit them to the clerk, we can include those as an appendage to the minutes if you like.
Sure.
There is a group headed by Marvin Reed, there's a transit committee that's a subcommittee of the TNT group, and they started as a group that just focused on the freebie, but with the MOU, we went through many of the provisions, including the one you just mentioned, and I know that they're working on those sections of it. So, and we can have him come in and give a report on where we stand with that. But a very good point. We definitely don't want that document sitting on the shelf collecting dust.
Right, and I think that the discounts, you need Princeton University's participation and maybe the merchants as well, New Jersey Transit, and none of those are on your committee. So I would recommend reaching out further than just that committee and get some professional help, including promotions, promotion relationship vendor to help the committee have a professional promotion plan.
Okay, thank you. Is there anybody else who has a comment on something that's not on the agenda? Okay, then we're moving on to reports, and our first report for this evening is our police report with Chief Sutter.
Thank you, Mayor. I really just have one item to bring to your attention, and that is with the report itself. I just want to bring your attention to the last 2 pages of the report, which is our K-9 activity report that Councilwoman Butler had spoken about at the last meeting. That will now be a regular piece of this report. And our K-9 team is just finishing up final stages of training, so that activity will be increasing as we go forward. I'd be glad to answer any questions that you may have.
Hi, Chief. Thanks. We've already heard from a member of the public that we are awaiting news from Ferguson, Missouri, and obviously there's been a lot of interest here and across the country resulting from the tragedy there, and we've talked at many meetings about the efforts we take care to have strong relations with the community and to prevent civil rights problems like we're seeing, unfortunately, too often across the country. Are you aware of preparations that are, are you aware of thinking about how to be ready for what may come depending on what happens?
Yes, to answer your question, as you said, we've been following these events since their inception, and we kind of looked at it 2 ways. One, it was a learning moment for all of us to see the things that we can do better here and how we can learn from these events. But there's a broader picture, and that is how these events will affect us here. And I've been monitoring very closely intelligence reports and getting up to date as recently as before I came into this meeting of things that may be going on in our area. So we're on top of it and ready to address anything.
Thanks. I was struck, I wanted to comment anyway, struck last night by observing Officer Narvaez and the amazing connections he's made in the community, and wanted to brief council and the public about plans. Everyone knows that President Obama issued an executive action last Thursday on immigration, and there's intense interest locally on what that means for people here, who's affected, who's not. And there's a concern that there's some information that's out there, but they haven't, the administration hasn't issued the final procedures for people to apply for deferred action. So there's concern that people will be subject to scams, perhaps, that there may be lawyers who will, tell people, give me a couple $1,000, I'll help you fill out your papers, when the papers haven't even been provided yet to the public. So Officer Narvaez contacted me this weekend that of his own initiative, apparently, right? I think he wanted to, he was not working, he was not even on duty this weekend, right? He went online and printed out in Spanish information from the U.S. Immigration Services and went last night and invited me to go with him to the Spanish language service at St. Paul's, and there were about 400 people there, and we spoke to the congregation and talked about the importance of looking for correct information from trusted sources, and he's helping organize with Elisa Nera and our Human Services Department and other interested citizens, including, I see Amner De Leon is here. They're organizing an information session on December 1. So there's an information session on December 1. Amner has contacted a Spanish-speaking lawyer, and we're going to probably get a couple Spanish-speaking lawyers who'll come and answer questions from the public. And the hope is really, as I saw last night, there was a lot of interest. We think, there may be a lot of people who can take advantage of this locally, but a lot of confusion about what it means. But I was most struck by, as we were talking to people after the service, how many people Jorge knew who were attending the service. And to me, it was the wonderful antidote to the tragic news, and what we see in Ferguson was seeing him being at the service and knowing so many people. And here was a police officer saying hi to so many people. So it felt good, and wanted folks to know that we do have this proactive plan, and we probably, I'm looking at Amner, we'll probably need to do successive trainings, because we're going to know more when the administration releases the actual paperwork that needs to be filed. But there seems to be intense interest in the community, and we want to make sure people know about it and nobody's taken advantage of while they're so vulnerable. So I real kudos, it's not even a question, I guess, but kudos to you about, I don't know what you've done with him, but in particular, but with all of them, that it was amazing that he was taking this initiative on his day off to come in and do this. So have you seen him? Have you heard about it? Or?
Yeah, I actually spoke with him today, and that is all his initiative. He is a member of the community, the local community, and highly invested and concerned. And he's really just been instrumental in that whole process. So we talk, and I let him do his thing, so it's worked out very well.
Well, you've given him a lot of flexibility to do this, and that's great, so thank you.
Great, thank you for sharing that too. It's really great to hear. Are there any other, yep, Ms. Butler?
Thank you for including the information about the K-9 unit. I noticed in the numbers that are the dispatch, we continue to have a lot of overtime in dispatch, and also that the number of parking violations that have been issued are way down. So we've got a revenue and expense problem going in the wrong direction.
That's true. We have actually addressed both issues. The first thing I'll point out with the dispatch issue, as I've explained to you previously, every time that we have even a day off in dispatch right now, it creates an overtime situation because there's no relief. We have addressed that situation and have put added personnel coming on in December, and hopefully we're going to be able to put them into the rotation where you'll see this overtime probably reduced drastically, because now when there's time off, extended leaves, whatever the case may be, we'll be able to plug these individuals in. As far as the parking revenue, the reason we did a comprehensive analysis of it. I've spoken with Mr. DeShield, we've spoken at Public Safety, and we're going to speak about it again this week at Public Safety. That is attributed to one specific thing. We are down a position from the same time last year. That was due to a variety of events that took place. So the decision point is, do we bring on another individual, one parking enforcement officer, that will make up those summonses? Again, I can't speak in terms of revenue, but I can speak in terms of productivity. And what our analysis showed was that almost entirely that loss is due to that one position. So that's the decision that has to be made. It's very, it's pretty straightforward.
Thank you. I think it is pretty straightforward. I have another question. The there's been some coverage in the local media about the situation at Tiger Inn, is that what it's, yeah, I got that right. And I wonder, the last thing that I read on that publicly was that we were not investigating that, and as you, we may be, but I thought the last comment I heard you quoted was that there had not, no one had come forward, the victim had not come forward, or that we wouldn't investigate without a victim, or something like that. But as you know, we no longer get the reports of the PFARs when they pick up students over on Prospect. It's been a concern of mine. I feel like this, from what I've read about this incident, that this probably was also involved underage consumption of alcohol. And frankly, I think we've taken our eye off the ball on that issue, and I'm just wondering, or certainly we as council people are no longer informed in the same way that I feel like we were informed in the borough when we saw statistics and reports about the number of people who were taken to the medical center, picked up at McCosh and taken to the medical center. So do you want to address all of that?
I understand your point. I would say that, respectfully, I would disagree with the point that, at least from my perspective, about taking our eye off the ball. We've probably never had more information from a police department standpoint than we do now. And the cooperation with the university police department is, I'm very satisfied with. But there's two conversations to be had regarding the Tiger Inn incident. The first being the investigation of the incident. We do have an active investigation opened. We do not have a victim. We do not have any witnesses that have come forward as of yet. So this is a very strange type of investigation from a police department perspective in terms of the scope to which we can extend it. We have conducted some interviews, and we will continue to investigate and keep it open. However, there has not even been any information given to us of a, other than the media accounts of a specific crime. We know that something occurred there. It may be a crime, and we're going to continue to investigate, but it's going to be wholly dependent upon somebody coming forward. Bigger than that is the conversation about the clubs and the things that you just raised. We are going to have a meeting with our with Gary de Blasio. I know Councilman Liverman was involved in this as well, and we're going to have conversations as we have in the past with the club presidents. I also plan on having a specific conversation with the Tiger Inn, if they're open to it, to not necessarily discuss the incident per se, but how we can better address all of these issues from a university standpoint, from the club standpoint, from the town standpoint, and from the police department. And, it definitely raises some issues that we need to look at, and we will do so.
If I could just follow up, if you have the information, it would be great if we also saw the information. Is that, we used to see it in the former borough as part of our police report.
What you used to get from the borough was the transports of intoxicated students from McCosh. We don't respond to McCosh. We were sending police officers to stand by and watch the first aid squad take individuals out of the McCosh Infirmary, and there was a whole host of discussions that led up to that decision, but it was, I felt that it was, not a good expenditure of personnel. The first aid squad was able to handle it. Princeton University has the public safety has the same first responder training that we have, and McCosh is a medical facility. So, in my opinion, it was akin to sending an officer to the hospital for some type of incident where we don't have the training that the personnel there had. And furthermore, there were HIPAA issues that were raised to us. So looking at all those things, I just didn't feel that it was a proper expenditure of manpower. And we're not, gathering that information. This is true, but I can, certainly look into it and go from there.
I respect your decision. That's your decision to make. But if you're getting information, I don't see it reflected in the police report. And to the extent that we are responsible for that part of town, and it may not have been a good use of your time, but it did give us a little window as council people and people who also ultimately have some responsibility to bear there. It did give us a window into what was going on, sort of representative, if you will, of what the problem was.
I agree with you to an extent that it gives you a window, maybe not into the incidents that are occurring, that's occurred at the Tiger Inn, but I guess into the alcohol use on campus. But this goes to such a bigger conversation that we by law just can't mandate that we, as the Princeton Police Department, respond there, and that's the law. That's what discussions were about, and I think it's overall it's working okay, absent the information that you're talking about. That information is there. I'm sure the university has it, and we can certainly inquire as to how we can obtain it.
Well, if PFARS is responding, can we get the information from PFARS?
That would be a conversation to have with them. The only consideration I'm sure that there is are HIPAA issues.
Ms. Howard, did you have a comment?
I just wanted to follow up on Councilwoman Butler's questions about on the overtime and make sure I understood what you were saying. So on the dispatch, we've known we've had the problem that goes back to the TTF report that we didn't calibrate the right number of perhaps dispatchers. And so do we have 2 new ones coming on before the end of the year? Have they been hired?
December 1st.
Oh, so hired, terrific. But then on patrol overtime, where it looks like it's getting better, I mean, is part of the issue that we have one officer who's at the academy, so we have one, but we're down one? I mean, we're down him, and when will we have the full force? And the second new officer, I think, is still in training, right? So do we have 2 officers who are counting as officers, but they're not fully out on patrol?
That's correct. So with the 2 officers in training, plus a extended injury, we're down 3 officers with the expectation that one of our newest officers may be ready by the new year, and that our officer in the academy will be ready probably by summertime, by the time academy and in-service training is done, of 2015.
At which point we'll probably be looking at new retirements.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. I want to thank you again for the report. I think just looks really good visually, and I want to thank Ms. Carmiller for asking for the motor vehicle stop information. I think that's a really great addition to the report, and thank you for including it. So, thanks. Our next report for this evening is about a new rule from the Security and Exchange Commission requiring municipalities to add to their disclosure, and I'd like to invite up Ed McManaman, who's our bond counsel, and Sherry Tracy from Phoenix Advisors. This is something that Citizens Finance Advisory Committee has talked about and reviewed, and Scott Sillers apologizes he wasn't able to come here tonight because of another commitment, but CFAC is supportive of the decision that's been made.
Thank you. Ed McManaman from McManaman, Scotland and Bauman. We did present the issue to the Finance Committee, and I have been accused of several times I've appeared on this issue to public bodies, and it's a technical issue, and so I'm going to try to not be too technical, but the SEC generally doesn't have jurisdiction over municipal securities. They do have jurisdiction over the underwriters who buy them. And there were no specific rules like there are for corporations to provide ongoing financial information to the market that buys and sells securities in the secondary market after they're initially issued. As a result, the SEC in 1995 imposed a rule on underwriters that said if you are going to buy securities from a municipality or a municipal entity, you need to obtain financial information from them if you plan to resell those to customers. The SEC couldn't require the municipalities or the local governments to do it, but they put it on the underwriters. Now, in New Jersey, virtually all the bonds are sold at a public sale. And so these underwriters are not going to try to get all this information together to bid and then lose. So it created essentially the official statements that you see that go out that in order to get bids, the issuers prepare these documents with financial information, and in them, the underwriters required that you commit to provide ongoing disclosure, and that has been scattered since that time. There are audits and budgets and operating data, material events, and sometimes the people who represented government said they would provide this information within 180 days. Some of it was 210 days. It's become 270 days. So there is a haphazard compliance across the board around the country with the filings of that information after bond issues are sold. And the SEC finally said that's not okay. And so they have essentially used the provisions of the securities laws dealing with representations that need to be made and whether they're made accurately. And they have put together what I call an amnesty program for all governments, that to the extent in the last 5 years you've had a bond issue, if you represented that you were going to do something and that didn't happen in the way it was represented, you can submit yourself to the jurisdiction of the SEC and indicate that you are reporting these failings, and in the future that won't happen any longer, and there will be specific compliance with those requirements. Their rule came out earlier this year, and the local finance board, Tom Neff, we were successful in having him essentially issue a local finance report that, while it isn't a requirement, it's a recommendation that comes with consequences if you don't follow it, to report these various things within the time frames, or else if you want to appear before the local finance board, they won't hear you. Essentially, the way that they judge you for aid and other things will be negative if you don't commit to do these disclosures. Now, the state does have control over local governments. The SEC does not. So this was all reported to your finance committee, and the general view was you should submit, because there are hundreds and hundreds in New Jersey alone who will be, by December 1, self-reporting these deficiencies in the committed to levels of disclosure. And the underwriters who bought these securities are actually fined a sum of money, in the aggregate $500,000, for issues they bought that didn't have the disclosure that was committed to. For local governments, there's simply a cease and desist if they cite you. So when the Finance Committee met, Phoenix Advisors, who is your consultant, was asked to do an analysis of all your bond issues for the borough, the former borough, and the former township, and there are many. And they've done a very comprehensive report that identifies what activities were done on time, what were done later, what might have been done at all. You are essentially in complete compliance at this point. Everything that's been required to be done has been submitted going forward. But there are deficiencies and haphazard between the borough and the township submissions to this entity called EMMA. And I think the view is that you will be well served to take advantage of this SEC initiative. It's not technically an amnesty, but it's an initiative that permits people to self-report. And so I will let Sherry advise you in terms of what her report showed, and then answer any questions that you have.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me, we didn't get this, we don't have this report, do we?
No, it didn't come through the packet.
Okay. And what the report it generally shows, and Ed gave a great summary of the program. We did one on both. We needed to do it on both the township issues and the borough prior issues, and then now Princeton itself, as a consolidated entity, has had two bond issues. So from each of those, we look back at any bond issue sold in the last 5 years, and then we review what disclosures were made in the 5 years prior to that. So some of the older issues, the oldest issue I think goes back, actually the township may have had one February of 2010, which is the oldest, so we have to look back 5 years from there. So we're looking at disclosure back from 2005. And with that, I can say, very honestly, the disclosure provided by both the borough the former borough and the former township is really good. It's pretty good, comparatively of what you see. As Ed said, this rule, this regulation, because it really wasn't governing issuers, was not followed very closely, paying attention to exactly what the bond documents required you to file. The audits, I think if an issuer had filed their audit to Emma, as Ed mentioned, which is a website by the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board. The MSRB has this website now, starting as of July 1st of 2009, where all the disclosure gets filed. Prior to that, it was sort of a system that didn't work so well for secondary market disclosure. Looking back before 9, it's hard to find out what the real data is because it had to be mailed to 4 separate places, repositories that were to accept the data. They scanned it, put it on their system. Sometimes it took them a couple of weeks. I've seen 8 or 9 months in some cases to upload it. You needed passwords to access it, so it was a system that really wasn't working. Looking back before 09 is difficult to get the real factual data from some of those, but we used Bloomberg as our main source for that, as they were one of the repositories and one of the only ones left, actually, where we could access the data. Going back from now through 2009 is a lot easier. Everything needs to be posted to Emma. So, we went through, as I mentioned, a comprehensive report of all township and borough issues, and then also the 2 done more recently from Princeton, and noted anything that was filed based on the bond documents, because each bond document has a certain prescribed items that are required, and also a timeline in which they are required. And with that, we do feel, although the disclosure is very good on both the township issues and the borough issues, we do feel it would be in Princeton's best interest to take advantage of the program and to report. The SEC is very firm in their stance of monitoring disclosure going forward, and they've been very vocal about reviewing the questionnaires that come in after December. What comes in on December 1st is the deadline. What happens after that if they don't see a self-report and they do find a material misstatement in a document? They've said that they will go after entities, and there could be monetary penalties involved at that point. At this point, we know under the program there's not. So it's something, it's really an effort for them to try to get the disclosure cleaned up a little bit. Again, really, Princeton's not really in bad shape at all. As Ed mentioned, all the disclosure's up to date at this point. But I'm saying even going back to 2005, the disclosure's been provided. Certain things that maybe were perhaps particularly on the borough rating changes. The borough was not rated AAA as the township was, so the borough before 2008 sometimes had bond insurance on its bonds to bring it from AA1 up to AAA. Bond insurance was really cheap, and everybody kind of purchased it, or at least the investors did. Technically, if there's a rating change from a bond insurer, not the borough, not the township, a bond insurer, you need to post, the issuer, the borough would need to post a notice to that effect. And the borough, it wouldn't be something the borough would be notified of. So there's those kind of items that come up in the review. Items such as posting budgets weren't always done because the budget isn't really required under the SEC rule 15C212. It might just be something that was required as part of the bond documents. So an annual budget wasn't always provided. As soon as it was adopted, it was of course schedules included in the audit.
Okay, thank you. And I think there's some interest in seeing the report from council, so did you want to see it, and then we can get a copy?
We did get it.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
Okay, you did. Good.
We did get it in an email.
Okay, good.
I have a question. Is this a report that is triggered every time we have a bond issue, or is it triggered by the calendar?
This report that's provided, thankfully, this is a one-time thing from the SEC, where they've had this program, at least this self-reporting program, They came out with this initiative, as they were calling it, March 9th of this year, and the reporting deadline is December 1st. It's a one-time review, take advantage of it. As far as disclosure going forward, this report is something that we do run every time there is a bond sale. We look back at the 5 years, because that is the statute of limitations for the SEC. We look back at what disclosures need to be done in the last 5 years. And if there was a late budget filed, if there was a material event from a bond insurer that changed and wasn't noted, we can disclose it in our official statement, and then we provided full disclosure. It's okay if you have those, those lateness, but it needs to be just disclosed in the official statements.
So each time you do a bond issue, you have to represent what you will do into the future, and you also have to represent if you hadn't done something in the past. So it is an analysis that needs to be done with every bond issue. And going forward, I think it will be simple because everybody will follow the local finance notice, I believe, in New Jersey. And New Jersey will be at the forefront of it because there are very specific things. And everybody has that notice that got sent by the local finance board. It's been talked about in the last 6 months significantly, and I think everybody now has to have an active file after the bonds are sold. In the past, you sold bonds, just put it down, pay the maturities and the interest when they're due. Now you really need to follow up on them and keep a file intact.
Thank you. Are there any more questions on the side?
Yeah, just a follow-up question to that. I think, Ed, I understood you to say that the exposure here was not the municipality but the underwriter. Is that correct?
Well, the jurisdiction of the SEC is on the underwriter, but the SEC has jurisdiction under what they call the anti-fraud provisions for material misrepresentations in any document. So the issue is the ability of issue to represent correctly what is happening. So they are, in simple terms, flexing their muscles to try to get into the control of the municipal market, and I believe with this effort they succeeded. They should have just done it directly, even though there's a constitutional issue in terms of their ability to do that, but that's really what's happened here indirectly. They have had people spend probably millions of dollars has been spent in this initiative around the country by underwriters and others. So they've got the control of it, and we're basically under the thumb of the SEC going forward.
Thank you.
Mr. Simon.
And simply following up on your remarks, in terms of looking back, I understand how a new bond issue triggers a look back and a report at that point. What I'm not clear on is what system we're putting in place for the bonds we've already issued, any follow-up reporting we have to do, because it wouldn't simply be on new bond issues, right? It would also be any sort of event that's required to be reportable back to the original issuer. Do we have a, I don't know, a tickler or whatever kind of a system in place for our finance department or for your office?
I think what happened for virtually everybody, at least in the state of New Jersey, they've hired a firm like Phoenix to bring them up to speed in terms of exactly where they are. So it should be easy at this point to represent where you are, and then going forward, you are going to commit to provide certain disclosure that should be easy to do because everybody's going to know exactly what it is, and they'll do exactly what this local finance notice says. So I believe that the jurisdiction the SEC has over the underwriter is to make sure that the underwriter has a reasonable basis when it buys securities to represent to its customers that this entity whose bonds they're buying is reliable in terms of what they're going to continue to provide in the secondary market. So when they buy and sell things, people can get accurate, up-to-date information. And I think this exercise with this report for you and similar reports around the state and around the country is creating the foundation for underwriters to be able to say to their customers, this information will be readily available to you on one site, accessible by you. You can pull it up. When the annual financial statement's done on February the 15th or the 10th, it'll be filed. When the audit is completed, it will be filed. When the budget is adopted, it will be filed. If there's any change in your credit rating, it will be filed. And so there'll be a standardization to it into the future that will make it easy going forward when you have a bond issue to say, Princeton will commit to do this, and the underwriter will be able to rely on it because we will have stated what they hadn't done in the past and have fixed it. And that's what the representation is. So there's two representations. What's happened in the past, and what are you committing to do in the future?
Okay, and then just one quick follow-up. Who actually owns that responsibility within the administration? Is that...
It's the finance office, okay? It's the depending on whether it's a chief financial officer, a comptroller, a treasurer, it's generally committed to in the document as somebody in the finance department providing that disclosure commitment. We have strongly urged around the state, we represent a lot of governments, and that they hire a firm that bears that responsibility. It's not an expensive proposition for firms like Phoenix to do it. And the view here is that if there is a professional commitment of understanding that it will be complied with for relatively small amounts of money, and it will be something you can rely on, most of the towns have done that. And those who haven't, there's a concern that they move along in their day and they do things and they don't think when February 10th comes they got the annual financial statement. So in all cases, we basically said to the finance office, keep this 5-page local finance notice on your, in a file. And if you have a bond issue, just follow it and know you have a responsibility. And I think the firms like Phoenix will provide a foundation that makes this more easily accomplished.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Just a very quick follow-up on that is that we do that for Princeton. Phoenix is doing that. We were doing that also last year before the local finance notice came out. This summer and this fall with those things. It was something as we saw the shift to disclosure becoming something that has more focus on it from the SEC. We started to do these voluntary submissions. We were doing it for the township the last several years, and then for Princeton now for almost 2 full years. So as soon as the AFS was done, we're calling the finance office to get it, or getting it from the state, posting it. Budgets, annual debt statements, even things that aren't required. And that's exactly where the local finance notice is now leading, and we'll continue to do those things.
Thank you very much.
It's pretty uncomplicated to access the markets for money by local governments. It's going to be slightly more complicated, a little bit more costly, but it will be easier.
Thank you. And I want to continue now with reports. Thank you very much for coming and for keeping us honest on this one. Ms. Howard? Nothing. Ms. Krummeller?
I just want to report that the Code Review Committee is looking at taxis and signs. We probably won't be ready for ordinances until the new year. Is there anything else, Lisa, from that? I don't know.
We had also started animals and animal control and not deer management, but deer feeding, anything related to animals.
Right. So those will be our next ordinances, but they'll probably be in January.
Yes. Correct.
Mr. Miller?
The Affordable Housing Task Force met last week for its organization meeting. I was elected chair, David Schreier vice chair. We had no volunteers for secretary, so we'll rotate that assignment at the meetings. Ms. Krummeller presented a list of municipally owned properties and properties owned by other entities in the community that might be used for housing, either affordable housing or market housing with an affordable component. That list was turned over to our staff for further review, and the results of that will be presented at the next meeting of the task force. The task force met at 1:30 on Thursday afternoon. There was some concern expressed by some members of the public that that was an inconvenient hour. We talked about other possible times for meeting of the task force, and it was agreed that we would hold some meetings at late afternoon hour, and most of the meetings at 1:30. The meetings will all be publicly noticed, and they're all open to the public.
Ms. Butler?
Yes, just to follow up on Ms. Krummeller's report, Jenny and I met with representatives of the cab company and Chief Sutter. If we'd like to have a meeting, they expressed some interest in feeling like perhaps maybe all the police aren't fully up to date on what the laws and rules are regarding some of the cab lines and whatnot, so they were wondering if part of our work together might not be, having somebody come and meet with them as a group. I think we'll be meeting with them again before we're finished with writing the ordinance. The rec board met last Thursday night. They passed a concussion policy, and I will distribute that. It's being sort of cleaned up at this point, and but they agreed in principle on a concussion policy that everybody who participates, all the different groups that participate in the rec offerings will be required to take about a half-hour online program on concussions to try to educate everyone about recognizing when people have suffered concussions and then what to do, how long people need to be out, who they need to see, etc. All the parks have been winterized, all the bathrooms, etc., have all been drained, and the pools closed officially. And I think that's it.
Mr. Simon?
No report.
Okay. I have a few reports. The first is there's a community Thanksgiving service on Thanksgiving morning at 11 a.m. at the University Chapel. It's open to everybody. And next Monday, December 1st, we're going to be having a special meeting of council here at 7 p.m. And it'll be reports. The entire meeting will be reports from chairs of all of our boards, committees, and commissions. So it'll be a useful meeting for council to get a snapshot of all the work that's going on across all of our boards and committees. And for members of the public, if you've ever considered applying to be on volunteering on one of our boards and commissions, it's a great opportunity to get a sense of what each of them do and where your interests might be if you're interested in volunteering. So I encourage people to come out to that. And if you can't make the meeting, we also post them online. Last week was the statewide New Jersey League of Municipalities Conference, and Princeton was recognized with 2 major awards when we were down there, which is very exciting. The first was from Sustainable Jersey. So in addition to receiving our silver status, we were also named as, we were also given the Leadership Award for the state of New Jersey for our work on sustainability. So that was really exciting, and thanks to Sustainable Princeton, I see Daniel Harris out there, and to all of the volunteers who helped to get us to that place. Secondly, we won an Innovation Award for the state for our work on consolidation. And again, that was an enormous group effort involving staff, many of the elected officials sitting up here today, and a lot of volunteers, many of whom are in this room too. So I want to thank everybody for helping get Princeton those 2 really great recognitions. We're also well represented on many of the panels. I did a panel with Bob McQueen on doing an IT strategic plan that was very well attended. People are interested in our work on that. And there's a really terrific panel with Councilwoman Heather Howard, with Chief Sutter, Elisa Niera from Human Services, Craig Garcia, who you might remember, who came in and helped with the wage theft ordinance, and a councilman from New Brunswick, John Anderson. And that was also well attended, and we had a lot of interest in the work we're doing here on reaching out to immigrant communities in town and building trusting relationships. And then finally, I was nominated and elected to serve on the executive board of the league. So it's nice. Princeton hasn't had a spot on the board in a while, so it's nice that we now have a spot and we're represented there. And then finally, there's a meeting earlier last week on the My Brother's Keeper initiative, which is a White House initiative to make sure that all young people in our community are getting the resources they need in order to live successful, productive lives. And we had a meeting with Superintendent Cochran, with other members of the school board, members of the staff. Chief Sutter was there, Elisa Niera, housing groups. We had the Clergy Association represented. We had representatives come down from HUD, and they were really excited that Princeton had embarked on this initiative. And the group identified 3 areas of focus for Princeton. The first one is ensuring that every child and their family feels connected to the community. The second is shrinking the opportunity gap, especially in the time between birth and kindergarten. And finally, facilitating and encouraging health and wellness. And this is an area where the municipality and the school district have a lot of overlap, and I think will lead to a lot of productive cooperation there. And the next steps are reaching out to some of the groups that are doing work on the ground, and also to the students and the families that are impacted. And with that, I want to see if there's any staff reports. Bob Gregory, did you have a report for us?
No, I knock this thing over every time I come up here. Thank you, Mayor. So I'm going to give a brief report on emergency management, specifically some training that the town has just gone through here. We started back in October where we had most department heads, managers, some staff, and some of the council take part in a training, an emergency operations center training that basically taught everyone what an emergency operation center was all about and the roles and responsibilities. And then we took that into a drill November 12th, and a group called Regional Catastrophic Planning that is actually a consultant paid for by FEMA that works out of the New Jersey State Police OEM put on the training, and they helped to organize and run the drill. The drill was basically, it's called Lightning Bolt, and it was a hurricane scenario, and the drill is designed to test and measure our effectiveness of the EOC. So it was real time. We had all our players, if you will, police, fire, EMS, public works, engineering, finance, some of our council attended in attendance, and we got real-time situations that came up. For example, trees closing roads, and we worked together as a team to figure out the solutions. So we came out with some real good points that we're going to work on December 8th. We're going to have a smaller debrief with a smaller group that was in the actual drill. And just to give you a snapshot, one of the things that we realized is people could not believe the amount of phone calls coming into the EOC. And normally our dispatch center and police take the brunt of those phone calls. So one of the things we'll discuss is, actually having call takers and how we can better utilize Access Princeton in that realm to take non-emergency phone calls and, non-emergency questions so that we can leave the dispatch center to handle the emergencies that come up in a situation like that. So, and then there were some IT issues we're going to look at, like just updating old television sets in the room to actually some possible emergency management software that'll actually help us do real-time, map of these roads are closed and help us, collect that in the database so we can constantly get information out. And then, of course, finally, something I've been working on with the local emergency planning committee, Patrick, Councilman Simon, Council President Miller and Councilwoman Howard, is communication, right? We communicate well when the electric devices are working, but how do we do it when they're not working? So we talked about that. We've been moving forward dealing with some community groups, and have recently, along with the county, started recruiting people for our CERT program. And that's Community Emergency Response Team. And hopefully that will help us to address some of the communications items that came up out of the drill. So I'm looking forward to our debrief and moving forward, working with Mark and the council to make this positive and, make sure we're prepared for whatever comes our way, even if it's snow on Wednesday. I heard a rumor. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other staff reports? Mr. Kaiser?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd just like to report that Jack West and I met with Avalon Bay this morning regarding the hospital demolition, and it's moving along on schedule. the large six-story building. It's probably about 40% demolished at this point, another couple of weeks before that's done. And then they will be working on the seven-story building, the largest remaining building, and they're working from east to west. So depending on how the weather is and so forth, they're hoping to be able to complete that work within the next 2 to 3 months.
Great, thank you. Any other reports? Nope, okay. No reports, no, okay. So now we'll move on to our work session for this evening, which is the Witherspoon Street corridor discussion. And many of you I see tonight were here back when we had our first meeting on this topic in September. And as we did at the last meeting, we've sent out notices to all the property owners on the corridor, and we of course invite their participation, and also we invite all residents to participate in tonight's discussion. As I said, at the last meeting in the past, it was difficult for us to coordinate all of the zones along Witherspoon Street because, of course, the former Borough Township line bisects the street. And now that we're consolidated, it seemed a good time to take another look at the zoning on the street and whether it makes sense. At the last meeting, we heard from many of you about the need to protect the residential quality of the street and also to be proactive in our planning. And we concluded that discussion by asking Mr. Solo to come back with a report on a capacity study of the corridor to get a better sense of the existing zoning and whether it matches the community's vision and the neighborhood's vision for the area. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Lee, and just to give folks a sense of how this is going to work, Lee will give a report. We'll bring it back up to council for some discussion. We'll open it up for anybody from the public who'd like to comment as well, and then we'll bring it back to council to figure out where we go from here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Solo.
Okay, thank you. As the Mayor indicated, we began this discussion back in September on the 22nd, and we talked primarily about permitted uses and zoning standards. I'm going to jump into a PowerPoint presentation that talks about the capacity that's there in terms of the zoning. But before I do, I'd like to refresh everybody's memory. When we met in September, we heard a lot of good comments, I think, from the public. As the Mayor indicated, we heard about protecting the character of the corridor. We heard about protecting residential areas. We heard about protecting business areas. We also heard about protecting the historical character of the area. And I think we need to keep in mind all of those comments as I talk about potential development and some of the uses that are there, because I think those are all critical. We also heard a lot of concerns, and they were regarding traffic, the size of buildings, sustainable development, gentrification and displacement, the streetscape that's there, and physical impacts. And then finally, we heard some concerns about how does this zoning works, will it provide what we really want, and how do we go about doing that? So what I'd like to do is just walk you through that analysis that focuses on what the zoning is. This is a map that we used, similar to what we used in September. It's also up on the wall. It's color-coded, and you're going to see this map throughout the presentation as we go zone by zone through each of the districts. What I want you to be aware of is as we look at each of the zones, keep in mind the colors. The yellow, which is very light on the map, is residential. Sky blue on the map are churches and institutions. The purple is a municipal entity. The pink or reddish is a commercial property. And then you'll see when we get to it, the cemetery and the hospital we've just left as white on the map. So to do this capacity analysis, as I indicated, we looked zone by zone along Witherspoon. I took a look at and used the data from the tax assessor's office in terms of existing development We did a calculation that would be what's the maximum you could get on any one lot or within the zone, and that was a simple calculation taking the floor area ratio, which is a ratio of the amount of development to the lot size that one could have. And we basically, in order to maximize that and see what the worst case scenario is, we assume a lot is going to be scraped and somebody would build on it brand new. And then surprisingly, as we were looking at the data, we said, geez, I don't know if you could fit that on the lot. And I'm going to run through some test fits for that, and in many instances you can't fit what the zoning allows on the lot, and we'll show you why, and usually that's due to either the setback requirements and the parking requirements that go along, especially with the zones that allow commercial developments. We also analyzed where possible a small lot, a medium-sized lot, and a larger lot, and in some instances we even looked at sort of a super large lot to see if somebody were to assemble a few parcels, what would be the impact. I think in September we started up at Nassau Street and worked our way down here to Valley Road. So tonight we're going to start at Valley Road and work our way towards Nassau Street. And the first zone is the R6, and you can see all that purple is the R6 zone. It runs from Valley Road to Community Park School. And as you can see, the R6 zone permits single-family homes, and then as conditional uses, all those municipal purposes are allowed. There are 5 parcels in the R6 zone. It's about 44 acres, and everything is either owned by the municipality or the school board. We stopped there with our analysis because any future development will be controlled either by the school board or the municipality, so we didn't see the need to do any test fits. Plus, the existing zone really limits the development that could occur if it were a private developer. So we then jump to the B1 zone. The B1 zone runs from just to the north of Guyot to just past Lee Avenue. In terms of the area, as you can see from the colors on the map, it's on either side of Witherspoon, and it truly is a mix of residential and retail uses throughout the zone. The B1 again permits single-family homes, it permits offices, retail use, restaurants, and banks. There are 27 parcels in this area, 12 of them are residential, 15 are businesses, and again, we only looked at ground floor because as we started looking at second and a half story floors, it was difficult to figure out, is it an office, is it an apartment, so we stuck pretty much with just what's on the ground floor. This area totals 6 acres. The existing buildings equal about 85,600 square feet of building is currently on the ground in the lots, but the FAR for a non-residential use would allow 150,000 square feet of space, so it's almost double the size of what's there. That 150,000 square feet would require about 752 parking spaces, so you can see there's an order of magnitude to the amount of space that could be built. If it were residential, it would allow slightly less in terms of almost 68,000 square feet. This is the first zone where we started to do a test fit. Just as a refresher, for a business use, the lot area is 4,356 square feet. That's the requirement. It's a fairly small lot. A front yard of 10 feet, a rear yard of 15, and the side yard was not. For a residence, the lot area is 10,890 square feet with a 25-foot front yard, a 15-foot rear yard, and a 15-foot side yard. I mention that because if you remember at the September meeting, we had one gentleman that got up and spoke about the difficulties he had with variances on the lot. In the B1 zone, many of the lots are small, which represents that sort of business use at 4,356 square feet. So if you want to have a residence, you need a bigger lot, and many of them don't meet that standard. So we looked at a small lot. Here's an example at 272 Witherspoon Street. It's about 4,000 square feet. And what the analysis showed is that if you had a 60% FAR, which is what's permitted, you could build a building of almost 2,500 square feet. Then the zoning allows a 3-story building, so we assume it's a 3-story because the smallest footprint, 828 square feet. That's kind of small, so I don't know if you'd really get it, but we wanted to be conservative on that. However, that size building, that 2,500 square foot building in the B1 zone requires 12 parking spaces. We made an assumption in terms of the size of the spaces, about 300 square feet for each space, because that allows for the parking space and some area to circulate around it, basically half an aisle width. And what you'll see is you can't fit it on. As a simple calculation, it's 4,428 square feet to provide that 3-story building with the parking. Then we did an analysis and said, okay, what'll fit? And on the right, you see what would fit. It's a 1-story building that's 1,000 square feet. It needs 5 parking spaces. That equals about 2,500 square feet. But what you'll see is we have the 10-foot front yard, we have a 15-foot rear yard, and that's about all you could fit. Somebody a little bit more creative than the designers here maybe could fit a little bit more in, but what it's showing you is that rather than that 60% FAR, you're really talking about a 24% FAR as to what would actually fit on the ground. Maybe somebody could get it up to 28. But it just shows you what happens to the smaller lots. The next slide shows you a medium-sized lot. In this case, it's 291 Witherspoon, which is about 8,500 square feet in area. And again, the existing building here is 1,600 square feet. The maximum FAR using the business zone would allow you to have a 5,100 square foot building. We did a 3-story building footprint. This would require 26 parking spaces, and you can see in red the 9,500 is the amount of the land that would be covered on your 8,500 square foot lot. So again, it's pointing out the zoning doesn't really work and allows for much more development than what you can have. So in our test fit case, we were able to use and utilize an FAR of 26%. That's about a 2,200 square foot 2-story building, so 1,100 square foot footprint, 11 parking spaces required, and again, 4,400 square feet on the 8,500. And you can see on the right, it's a little faded how that lays out with the building to the front and the parking behind and a little bit of a rear yard for it. And you'll see this again and again in the business zones. The parking really restricts the development, and then when you add on the setbacks and open space requirements, it becomes even more restrictive. The next lot was a larger lot. This is the largest in the B1 zone. It's 16,999 square feet. This is actually where the old gas station is at the corner of Witherspoon and Henry, across from the Packet buildings. And again, using the 60% FAR, it allowed about 10,000 square feet of building, which required the 51 parking spaces. And you can again see we're at 18,700 square feet in terms of the land area that you would need on a 17,000 square foot lot. It didn't fit. We show you on the right side the test fit, and again, now we're at an FAR of 34%, where 60% is allowed. It's a 5,800 square foot building requiring 29 parking spaces, and you can really see how much the parking eats up in terms of the land area, and we're at about 11,600. So again, we were saying there's something wrong here. Throughout this, we didn't bother to analyze just the simple residential, because you can always fit a house on any of these lots, and we didn't see the need to keep going over various sketches. Then we took one more look.
Can I just ask a quick question? For the parking, is that independent of use? That we're just saying that 51 spaces just seems like an awful lot of spaces, and is that for any business that goes in there, or?
Yes, there are 2 parking standards you should be aware of. In the former township, the requirement is 1 parking space for every 200 square feet, or 5 per 1,000. In the former borough, it's 1 per 300, and we use those in each of the zones for that. And when we get into the mixed-use zones, we added in the parking that would be required for apartments as well. Moving on, the last lot in the B1, we said, what happens if somebody acquired a few of these parcels? So we're looking at combining a bunch of the properties. It's about a little over 42,000 square feet. If you did a 60% FAR, you're talking a fairly good-sized building at 25,500 square feet, requiring 128 parking spaces. And again, we couldn't fit it in using a simple calculation. And we said, what would fit there, and you can see our sketch on the right. We have a 13,000 square foot building. That's about a 31% FAR for a lot this size. And then we assumed it would just be a two-story building at 6,500 square feet because it fit. 65 parking spaces required, eating up over 19,000 square feet of the parcel. And that fits, and it respects most of the setback requirements. Realize these are just sketches. We haven't engineered anything. We were just sort of figuring out what would fit, what would make sense, using some fairly standard rules of thumb. I think I'll just keep going unless, Mayor, you want me to stop for a couple questions on the B1?
I have a quick process question. You've been saying "we," and was this done internally?
It was all done internally.
Is this a royal "we," or is this a...
Jack West and Derek Bridger are here, and Eileen Coternio, who's not. She did a lot of the PowerPoint, but it was an internal effort. It was all done by staff, and we pulled together to put the sketches and all the calculations together and back and forth on how the zoning would work.
Very impressive. I was wondering if you had, we had talked about a consultant at some point, so that's what I was confused about. Yeah.
I think at the end of the night, we're going to have to talk about, it was a tremendous effort on our part, and I apologize for bringing it tonight and not getting to you sooner, but we just couldn't get it out any quicker. One of the issues may be if we want to move at a quicker pace, we may want to bring in a consultant to help us. And we're going to start getting a little bit more specialized and technical, I think, when we talk about next steps.
And I was just going to interject, too, that we'll put this presentation up on the website. Normally, it would get included in the agenda packet. It wasn't tonight, but we'll make sure that it gets up there.
The next slide shows you 3 zones, and they are the RO, the MRRO, and the R4A. The RO is a retail office zone. It's the 2 office buildings at the corner of Henry and Witherspoon Street that were part of the hospital site. They're going to remain there. The MRRO is the former hospital site, so we're all on the east side of Witherspoon Street, and then across Franklin Avenue is Maple and Franklin Terrace, and that's the only R4 zone in the area. So what do we know about the RO? As I said, it's a retail and office zone. It allows offices, retail services, restaurants, banks, and hospital-related uses. It's a single parcel. It's approximately 0.9 acres in size. The existing building is around 60,000 square feet. Now that includes the basement area, which has been converted or is being converted to office use. At the time when we got the information from the hospital and we set the FAR parameters, they didn't count the basement. So the FAR only allows 53,000 square feet of space. So the site is basically built out, and we didn't do any more sketching on that because we assume those 2 buildings will remain and be rehabilitated, which is currently what's ongoing. The MRO site is the former hospital. It has an approval from Avalon Bay for 280 residential units. It's about 5.6 acres in size. You can see it provided for a variety of retail uses as well as office, retail, restaurant, and the like. Avalon Bay has chosen just to build the 280 residential units. So again, we didn't do any more analysis in terms of this site because we saw it as being built out and not much opportunity for change there. The R4A, as indicated, is Maple and Franklin Terrace. The R4A permits single-family, 2-family attached dwellings, multiple family dwellings. It's basically 2 parcels. One is a municipal-owned parcel, one is owned by the Housing Authority. It's about 1.4 acres in size. There are 20 units there. Under the existing FAR, they could build about 27,810 square feet, so a little bit more than what they have there. And again, we didn't go into any more analysis of that because there's just too many unknowns in terms of what may or may not happen there. So staff shied away from looking at that.
Well, just to interject, also that lot's going to come into ownership of the municipality.
I'm not talking about the parking lot.
Oh, you're not?
In front on Witherspoon.
Oh, okay.
It's adjacent. This slide is just dealing with the, oops.
Okay, because the parking lot's also R4A, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's, I think that's a little over an acre in size, But again, I was trying
Right,
during
sorry.
the study just to focus on those properties
Okay.
that front on Witherspoon.
I didn't mean to interject a new
Yeah,
subject,
and I
sorry.
think there's also, as Councilman Miller indicated, an affordable housing task force that's beginning the job of looking at some of those sites, and I know that one's come up a number of times. So staff made a conscious decision to say, let's not get too much into that. If the community or council wants us to get a little bit more involved, we can start doing some sketching and some what-ifs. There were just too many unknowns. Similarly, we heard comments, well, why aren't you looking at the Valley Road School? There's just too many unknowns for staff to feel comfortable saying, here's what could happen, because we're not going to be the decision makers in either of those cases.
Well, also, any publicly owned property is not subject to zoning, correct? I mean, regulations.
For the most part, yes. The R4 zone, there are two distinct R4 zones in the community. The southerly one goes from Paul Robeson to Quarry Street. It's on both sides of the street. On the west side, there's a mixture, as you can see from the slide, of institutional uses, retail, and residences. On the east side, that's the cemetery, and we just left it white so it would stick out a little bit more. To the north, there's another R4, and there's a break in the map. So you jump down to Clay Street, and from Clay Street to almost Lee Avenue, you'll see there's an R4 district. And that R4 area is all residential fronting on Witherspoon. Again, the R4 permits single-family, two-family, attached dwellings, and multiple family dwellings. There are 12 parcels, as I indicated, in two separate areas. There are 5 parcels that are churches, institutions, or municipally owned, 6 residential properties, and 1 property that was kind of split in the middle between both residential and office, so we just called it as its own. There's approximately 1.7 acres in the R4 zone that fronts on Witherspoon. The existing buildings total approximately 33,800 square feet in area. We looked at the FAR for 2 uses here, the single family, which would have yielded, it's a .40, 29,500, and multifamily at 30,188. Again, so this zone is, for all intents and purposes, built out, and we didn't see a whole lot of development potential, but we did do a little bit of analysis, and what we found is, first, new construction is going to be constrained because of the setbacks that are required. For a single family, it's a front yard of 25 feet, a rear yard of 35 feet, and the side yards are 8 and 20, and the side yards are really important. And for multifamily, it's a smaller front yard and smaller rear yard, they're 15 and 25, but the side yard setbacks are 15 and 30. And the reason that's important, when we look at a couple of the examples, we'll talk about the lot width size in the R4 zone. They're fairly narrow lots. So what we found when we tried to do test fit, you're only going to fit on what's already there. Part of the reason is most of the homes probably predate some of the zoning, so that they're not a perfect fit at all. So these narrow lots really provided a design challenge. Multifamily and attached units also have a requirement for usable open space. So in addition to the setbacks, you have to have the usable open space, which even further restricts the amount of development you could have. There's also a requirement in the R4 that the multifamily and attached units, an attached unit is really a townhouse type unit or a duplex, and you can only have 3 units in any structure. So what that means is if you have 3 units or you wanted to have a development and you had the area to have 7, you'd have to have 3, 3, and 1. There'd have to be separation between the units. Again, it restricts the amount of development that you could have as opposed to just having one large building, and that's why that restriction was put in. And then just to note that the zone does permit multifamily and attached dwellings. There aren't a lot of those in the zone. There are a number of single-family homes that have been, over the years, converted to more than 1 unit. But it has a residential feel, and I did want to point out that one of the concerns would be if you get more multifamily or attached, it's probably going to change a little bit the character in the R4, and we may have to look at that. So when we tried to do an analysis, again, sticking with our, let's look at a small lot and a medium-sized lot, here's a good example of a small lot. It's only 2,500 square feet in area. This lot is 25 feet wide and 109 feet long. So we didn't do a sketch because basically the building that's there is all you're going to get. That building is about 1,168 square feet. The FAR would only allow for a single family 1,000 or 1,100 for a multifamily. You could not possibly meet the setbacks, but this is a slightly unusual case. This is the smallest lot, I think, in the zone, but there are others that are a little bit bigger, but still small or very narrow, and that restricts the development. Jenny?
What is that in acres about? Do you know?
Well, an acre is 43,560, so this is less than 5%, not even. It's tiny. More representative in the zone is a lot like we're showing here. That's about 7,700 square feet. The existing building is around 1,300 square feet. You could probably build a little over 3,000 square feet as a single family or multifamily. We did a similar calculation, and you can see that as a residential use, there's a lot less parking. You might be able to fit on, the calculation says you could fit it on. However, when we looked at this lot is 60 feet wide and 128 feet deep. We could not fit on the larger multifamily structure. We could fit about 3,200 square feet. Couldn't really get a multifamily. This is really just a duplex because of the parking requirement. There's a 1.5 space for each unit when it's a residential in the borough, so there's 3 parking spaces. We were respecting the 35-foot rear setback because we thought that's important with a residential property as well, and you can't push the house any further back anyhow. So you can see, even though the calculation says you might be able to get a more units on the site, we couldn't fit it in this example. And again, it's primarily because of the lot width. The next zone is the RB. It's a residential business zone. In this case, it runs from just to the south of Franklin Avenue on the other side of Maple Terrace. You can see the RB. It's on both sides of the street, and it goes up to about Quarry Street. It's a mix of uses. Again, the red is retail, the yellow is residential, the sky blue, that's a church, and then on the edges outside of the zone were some publicly owned property. You can see there's a fairly solid core on the east side of residential properties. It's in a mixed-use zone. At some point, we may, if we decide to go ahead, we may want to talk about whether you want to preserve just the residential character or the mixed use for the zone. Again, this zone permits single-family, two-family, attached, multiple-family, a mixed-use building, which under our zoning code is referred to as a joint occupancy building. Basically, the ground floor is non-residential and the upper floors are residential. The non-residential component can be an office, a retail, a service, business use, or a restaurant. There are 29 parcels in the RB zone. 18 of them are residential, 10 are a business. There's one institutional church. It's about 4.5 acres in size. The existing buildings that are there are around almost 84,000 square feet. However, the zoning would allow for multifamily almost 178,000 square feet, and for a joint occupancy building about 119,000 square feet.
Wait, does this mean it's not, a residential is not required? You can have purely business?
No. Wait. The businesses are limited to the first floor. I said that right, Derek? 40% of the total building, but limited to the first floor.
Okay, so each building is required to have a residence?
Yes. The RB, again, similar to the other districts, it's constrained due to the setback requirements, which, again, the side yard is anywhere from 10 to 20 feet in a requirement. And narrow lots, again, presented a challenge in providing adequate parking, circulation, and meeting the side yard setbacks. So when we looked at a couple of representative lots, and we have two of them up here, the one on the left is the medium-sized lot. It's about 6,500 square feet, the 60% FAR, and you can see that while it would allow almost 4,000 square feet of building, but it would require 13 parking spaces, and what we did for that calculation is we looked at the ground floor, did a calculation at that 1 per 300 for the parking requirement, and then made an assumption as to how many units would be up above. We were using a fairly small unit size so that the unit count was a little high, but that's being conservative, saying if that's what they wanted, you need the 13 spaces. So you're already at 5213, which is not more than the 6,500 square feet, but with the side yard and front yard and rear yard, you're not going to fit it on. Same scenario, well, multifamily was an even worse case scenario because the FAR bumps up to 90%, so it's a bigger building. Parking was a little bit higher. And you can see you couldn't fit that on the smaller lot, 160 to 162 Witherspoon. Similar results, you basically bump up against the lot size when you allow in the side and front yard setbacks. We did look at a larger lot, and 190 to 198 Witherspoon Street is a good example of that. This is really two lots, but they're in common ownership. The two lots have 103 feet in width, and they're about 125 feet deep. And you can see once we get a larger lot with some wider width, you can begin to see that development could occur there. Our calculations showed, well, you might be able to fit the maximum FAR, which is almost a 7,800 square foot building with 26 parking spaces. But geez, at 10,388 square feet, you're not going to have any of the side yard or rear yard or front yard requirements. The multifamily pushed us a little bit over. When we did a test fit, we found we could fit a 5,700 square foot building on that lot. That would probably be a two-story building with a 2,850 square foot footprint, so it's the same for the mixed-use building and the multifamily. The required parking for the joint occupancy was 17, and for the multifamily was 15 spaces. And the ground area covered was around 7,900 square feet and 7,300 square feet. The example on the right just shows you the joint occupancy, but if it were just a multifamily building, that would fit on the lot as well. And that comes out to an FAR of about 44% versus the 60% and the 90%. Then, similar to the B1, we said, what happens if somebody acquired a lot of the lots in the area? So we looked at 165 to 181, and we got a little bit less than an acre of land. This is 33,000 square feet. And you can see the existing buildings on those lots that are currently there total about 8,400 square feet. The maximum FAR for a joint occupancy building is almost 20,000 square feet, and about 30,000 square feet for a multifamily. We did our parking calculation, which shows for the joint occupancy building, you would need 55 spaces, or for a multifamily, you would need, because it's a much bigger building, 75 parking spaces. And you're very close up against what would be the existing lot area at around 33,000 square feet with 23 and 32.
So if someone buys contiguous properties, do the setbacks then become as if it were automatically, as if it were a larger lot?
Well, the setbacks don't change. The setbacks remain if there's a 10-foot side yard setback for a 20-foot wide lot or a 50-foot wide lot, it's 10 feet. What changes is the floor area ratio, because the FAR is calculated on the size of the lot. And so that 60% is 60% in this case of the 33,317, just as it could have been 60% on the previous page of the 12,940 square foot lot.
But what about the side?
Setbacks always remain the same.
But the side setbacks, do they still?
They still apply.
Okay, so you can't just build a humongous building.
Well, you can. If you get a bigger lot, the FAR increases. You can't maximize that benefit on a narrow lot because of the setbacks. But here, this combined lot
Can I ask Ms. Krummel's question in a different way? I think what you're asking is, does it stay 2 lots, or does it, so
automatically.
Are there, you know, say you have a rectangle that's divided in 2, do you have to, but it's one, it becomes 1 lot, right?
Technically, it becomes 1 lot. If they choose to keep it as separate lots, then they'd have to meet the setback from that
that's exactly
interior
what I was
lot
asking.
line. But usually, they would do what we call consolidate the lot. That lot line then vanishes.
But do they have to get approval to do that, or they can just automatically get that?
Pretty much automatic. We don't have any reason to say no. Our requirements are more of a minimum standard, not a maximum. So with this really large lot, you can see, even though the FAR allows a lot of development, it's the parking that, again, and this example really shows you the parking requirement. So we were only able to, we got close, but we could only fit 55% of the FAR. So rather, you know, we had a 20,000 square foot joint occupancy building. We could only fit around 18,000 square feet. And for multifamily, that's not going to change that much. You might be able to bump it up a little bit because of the parking calculation. But again, you can see here, 53 parking spaces eating up almost 16,000 square feet of the land area. So somebody being creative maybe could get a little bit closer to the 60% for the joint occupancy, but there's no way they could get to the 90% for a multifamily. So again, it's showing you the existing zoning allows a lot of potential, but it's unrealized because of either parking or setback requirements. The last zone that we're going to talk about is the CB, the Central Business Zone. In this case, it's running from Paul Robeson to Nassau Street. The permitted uses, it does allow all the residential uses. It does allow office buildings, banks, hotels, theaters, medical offices, mixed-use buildings, and planned commercial developments. There's about 20 parcels, not surprisingly. 18 are business or some sort of mixed use. 2 are municipal-owned properties. It's about 2.1 acres in size. The existing buildings are 174,000 square feet in area. The FAR calculation only comes out to 141,000. Again, existing buildings that predate zoning, and the CB zone, as you are aware, is much larger than just the Witherspoon corridor. So it's not one size fits all. But all the lots, except for the municipal-owned lot, one of the municipal-owned lots, are built out. There is a historic district overlay, which would help to prevent any kind of tear down in the zone. And again, similar to the other zones, the parking really limits any future development because there's very little room. They're very narrow lots to do parking. I can go back maybe to the first map. But that's a quick summary of sort of the uses. I'm anxious to hear your opinions. Lots of information. I think as we talk about it, we need to think about not only the technical zoning aspects, but the use aspects, and then maybe a little discussion of where do we want to go from here and what do we want this corridor to be? Because you can see from the different colors, almost all the zones have some mixed-use character to them, maybe with the exception of the municipal R6 zone that's down here. But I'll go back up to that overall map, maybe to help with some of the discussion. And I'll take questions or...
Well, I want to thank you and the rest of the staff for putting this together. This was extremely informative, and we embarked on this because I think the zoning is confusing to a lay person and reading it and trying to figure out what it really means, and this really helps to illustrate what it means, and I think that was one of our first goals, is just to get a good understanding. And I would say to frame this discussion, one of the questions that would be helpful to think about tonight and to try to answer is this zoning, does it work, even if it's not the simplest way of going about it? Does it work well enough that we say, okay, now we understand it and we're okay with it, or do we want to go to the next step? So that's where we want to end. We want to have some answer to that question by the end of our discussion tonight, as to whether we want to take the next step and what that might be.
Well, one question I have is, let's just say we said we don't, we're worried about some of the larger buildings that could be built, and we'd like to limit the size of that. Is it legal to change zoning such that, like, the property owner can't build something as large as the existing zoning? I guess it's called down zoning, right?
Well, I think we have to go through a planning process, and part of that planning process is goal setting, stating a community vision. Some of the analysis we've done where you could say, well, the FAR is 60% or 90%, but you can't really fit that on there. You're not really down zoning in the traditional sense, and yes, you're not going to be allowed to do 60%. Maybe we're going to say you can do 40, because that's all that you could fit on there, and I'm sure over the course of tonight or some future meetings, we'll hear from others who will maybe be a little bit more creative than we were and say, well, we could get it up to 45%. But I think as a community, we need to discuss those issues. There are lots of ways we can deal with that. We talked more than 10 years ago, probably, when we first introduced an FAR concept in the borough to address that kind of issue, and we put in an FAR. We talked about, do you want to put a cap on the size of any structure on a lot, and you can do that. So there are tools that are out there. Another example maybe it's not so much the size of the building, but what it looks like, and we talked about whether we wanted to have some sort of traditional or design standard using existing zoning, or if we wanted to go to a form-based code which would deal with what does it look like, and saying, well, maybe we could take a little bit more development if we had a better way to control what it looked like. So there are a couple of options out there. I did talk with Trishka about whether we could do something about somebody aggregating a bunch of lots together, and she said you can't prevent somebody from buying property. So you can't say, no, you can't own 5 lots in this zone.
Can you get email on that computer? Oh, okay, because I sent you an image that I was hoping to show, but I should have done it ahead of time. But what it was is on a real estate website, there's a heat map of real estate prices or property values. And the Witherspoon, it's really, I wish I could show you, because the picture is, kind of like all, like light brown and dark brown is more expensive, and then tan is cheaper. And the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood is in stark contrast. It's like right in the middle of town, and the property values are lower. So it just, I think that's one reason developers are interested in that area. And not interested in, say, the central business district, because we're always talking about how we want to make our town more walkable. But really, if we want to add more density, it seems to me like it makes more sense to add it in the central business district. But the property values there are a lot higher. I don't know. So I'm just throwing that out to think about, because that image that I have of this really, it's like a real estate opportunity. If you're a real estate mogul, that's where in Princeton, if you wanted to invest, that's where you should invest. It's really obvious when you look at this map.
I have a question about, are there any problems with having it so that you have this higher FAR than you can really build, and what's controlling it is the parking? It seems like it would make more sense to have the FAR really match what you can build, but are there any other issues with that that could potentially lead to problems if you have a high FAR? Could somebody, for example, come in and say, well, I should be able to build this FAR and your parking requirement is just impossible?
Well, that would be the concern. In a perfect world, you like your zoning to match up to what you can actually build, and usually that's how we craft a new zoning ordinance. Here, where they were probably overlaying zoning on existing development, a lot of choices needed to be made as to what the restriction was be, and maybe they just said, let's choose a high number so everybody's okay. And that happens a lot. The concern would be more, and this is what happens at whether it's the zoning board or the planning board, if your FAR, and that's really the key thing, says you can have a 10,000 square foot building. and a builder comes in, and whether he wants 10,000 or 5,000 or whatever, and he says, but your zone plan, your vision for this area is this amount of development, and I'd like to build that amount or close to it, but I think your parking standards are a little high. And they can provide testimony why, or the use I'm going to provide doesn't need as much parking as your standards say, and I can give you testimony and good reasons why, or your setbacks are a little onerous, and if you just cut me a little bit of break on the setbacks, I can build, and provide to the town the building that they envisioned on the site. So that's the concern, and that's the reality that occasionally, and we haven't had a lot of applications like that in front of the Planning or Zoning Board, but there's an expectation, I think, in the development community that if the FAR says you can have 10,000, then that's what they're going to shoot for. But the development community also knows they can't sell or rent an office without the parking, or a house without some parking. So there are trade-offs that will be made, but the concern in terms of from after I did the analysis was more of a concern saying, if somebody comes in and says, your zone plan says you see this as a really built-out area, they're right, because that's what it's saying. That's the message it's giving you, is that we want a lot of non-residential development.
The other issue that came up when Barry Royce from the Zoning Board came and gave his presentation at the last meeting, and then there was a lot of discussion about it at the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood meeting over the weekend, was this issue with non-complying lots because of their undersized, and how much of that do you see along Witherspoon Street itself?
There's a fair amount of that, but all of those non-complying lots are grandfathered, and rather than we could try to cookie cutter our zoning to match and probably quadruple the number of zones we have, because there are some pockets where you have much smaller lots. Another way to do it is just to not require them, because what the zoning board sees is when there's a substandard lot and there's an existing house on it and a builder scrapes it and then he wants to build a new house, we call out a variance for the lot area, and that's why he comes to the zoning board. Sometimes there's setback variances as well, because the house maybe is a little bigger than the other one and it's closer to the neighbors. But for the most part, the lot is substandard, and because the way the zoning is written, that once there's no longer a house there, they lose that grandfathering, and they come to the zoning board. And I think what you heard from Mr. Royce was a little bit of frustration from the zoning board, because they get a lot of people saying, can't you deny this? And they really can't, because what you have is a buildable lot. It was an existing home. There's a house on either side. There's a house to the back. The zoning board has no real legal reason to say no. In this case, because of the lot area, they could say no if they were asking for a side yard setback or a house that exceeded the FAR. So I think another solution or potential solution would be just to grandfather those and call out in the zoning and saying, these existing lots where there's development all around don't need the lot area variance. But in the past, there's been conscious decisions to require those, so at least those neighbors get to have some say. Oftentimes, that's where some discussion occurs as to additional landscaping, the placement of the driveway, and that kind of thing. So I think there are other solutions to the problem that Barry was talking about. And as we redo the zoning, we'll have that continuing discussion, because we have that down, and Barry Royce serves on the committee that's reviewing the zoning to talk about that and say what are the pros and cons of just simply saying you don't need that variance if it's a lot area and it was existing since 1980 or something like that.
Okay. Are there any other questions before we open it up to the public? No. Okay, can I just get a show of hands of how many people would like to speak on this tonight? Okay, great. Well, come on up, if you can just all line up behind the mic. And a special request from the clerk is if you would like your comments to be memorialized in the minutes, which you do, please make sure you speak right into the mic and start with your name and address, so that we make sure we get those noted in the minutes. And Mr. Miller, will you help with the timing again? We're going to ask people for 3 minutes. Thank you.
When I raise Please note that when I raise my hand, you have 1 minute remaining.
My name is Yaina Moore. I live at 19 Green Street, and I am going to beg the indulgence of the President of Council to a little longer time because I am here to summarize some of the comments that were made at the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood meeting 2 Saturdays ago. So it is, and maybe a little lengthy, it's not just a personal opinion, but it is a compilation. I would like to sort of go over some of the neighborhood concerns around the Witherspoon Street corridor, which historically was the street that African Americans were destined to, as a result of being prevented from patronizing shops on southern part of Witherspoon and Nassau Street. It was African Lane, as it was referred to. It obviously is a very important spine of the African American community, and Witherspoon Street, along with the streets that run perpendicular to it, bound by John and all the way to Byard Lane, extending Lee and Birch Avenue, are considered the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood. Of course, there were other streets, John, that extended up to Nassau, and Jackson Street that was demolished to create Paul Robeson Place. And of course, John, it was removed in its former self to allow for the development of Palmer Square. Some of the general problems, and Lee stated them, that the neighborhood has talked about for a long time, has been with a real concern about developers buying multiple properties, and certainly the lot assemblage and consolidation issue of properties, of which 85 to 90% in the neighborhood are non-conforming, and which it affords the developer to rightly seek and ultimately obtain variances. So that results in buildings that do not fit. There's more dense development, unaffordable redevelopment of those properties, incompatible designs, which Mr. Solo talked about, absentee ownership, overcrowding in investor units, abandoned properties, increased gentrification, and although there are legitimate questions as to whether a COA survey that identified over 150 units in need of repairs is extensive as they claim, there is a need for many homeowners to be able to make standard repairs and upgrades for which there are onerous requirements due to the non-compliant issue within zoning of what those 90% of those properties are. So I thank Lee for his laborious effort, which ultimately concluded with the parking requirement being the disincentive or the limit to growth. But what I would hope our community looks towards and has tried to work on since I co-chaired an effort to look at the Witherspoon corridor is a vision as to what we want, providing incentives designed to achieve that desired effect. And so recommendations for the Witherspoon corridor, and it would also apply to the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood, is that it does take the form-based approach, and that size, height, setbacks, uses, street orientation, all of that, including parking accommodations, whether on-street permits and the like, are part of reaffirming what is there. There was also an effort several years ago that looked at historic district for whatever 400 houses, which is a really extensive effort. as a side note, and what I've always heard from residents is that it's not only about buildings when you're looking at a district, and although there are some specific buildings that are really should be designated historic sites, it's the neighborhood residents who have historically given life to the neighborhood that are most important to help in terms of being able to stay there. So specifically in discussions at the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood meeting was to really bring the neighborhood into conformity through rezoning. And this was an effort when I was a member of the Zoning Amendment Review Committee of the Planning Board that was attempted to actually bring into compliance the 90%, therefore 100% of the properties in the neighborhood, which would establish, instead of a minimum, a maximum size for lots. So that if the lots average on 3,000 square feet, make that the maximum. That begins to establish the framework for what the buildings are going to be. More houses of size and type that the zoning, that the buildings have already established. It would help facilitate the accessory dwelling unit ordinance that was passed in order to help people age in place. What it would also do is maintain the RB zone and perhaps extend that into what was formerly the township, limit commercial to Witherspoon Street and to the first floor of primarily residential buildings, which is the RB zoning, and that you do a per site built property square foot limit on commercial area. You have neighborhood services that serve the neighborhood demographic, which I will refer to as Ann's Palm Beach ordinance, which she may speak to later, Ann Neumann, and limit financial institutions as are limited in the commercial district, including check cashing and banks. Encourage zoning along Witherspoon Street in that mixed zone that would continue to facilitate more owner occupancy, and that really is a goal throughout. And in that mixed zone, that ownership can help financially support their owner or rented first floor businesses. Businesses that are limited to the first floor, square footage base, and exclude formula businesses. And with regard to the MRO zone and the RO zones, there was never an agreement on the part of the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood that as much commercial area that was in the MRR zoning would be a desired. That was a default due to unusable ground floor space that was part of the existing hospital.
I hate to cut you off, but it's been about 10 minutes. I just make sure everybody gets a chance to speak.
I'm just got 2 more lines. So that even in looking at what that had allowed, and even though this developer is only going to do residential, it would have probably been more and caused for more outside people use of that commercial than to have neighborhood-supported uses. And finally, abandoned properties. Not only as a safety hazard, they shouldn't be rewarded for the neglect in the lowering of taxes, as I know many have come to petition their blight, their further blight, so lower my taxes. The City of Trenton has recently established a fine program, and the City of Washington, D.C. has a tax base premium for abandoned properties to, in fact, in that case, provide a disincentive for abandoned properties. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry for being so long.
No, points well taken. Mayor Reed? And if there's other people who want to speak, it just helps if you can just stand up and line up behind the microphone. It helps the meeting to move.
I'll try to keep this very brief. I'm chair of the Master Plan Committee, and Master Plan Committee has already begun to see the need to do some visioning in the John Witherspoon neighborhood, and also begin to see the turnover of property ownership that would give us an indication that there are people buying properties with the idea of further developing them. And it behooves us to see that if we're going to put any kind of zoning standard guidelines onto the way in which redevelopment may occur in the John Witherspoon neighborhood, we have to do it before we actually get to the application stage. And that's part of the process that you've begun here. A couple of things at the meetings that we've had so far, both people coming to our meetings and us going to meetings such as the one you attended with me the past weekend before past with the John Witherspoon neighborhood, that when you talk with the neighbors, the existing zoning, while it's confusing, isn't so bad. It tends to give them what